Victorianism. I designed this one as we are doing our distance learning here to provide us the background material we're going to need to really get us into this second major unit of the year. And since every one of our novels is British Victorianism, I think it's a great value for us to have this immediately in front of us as we go. So I find there are a lot of information here of extreme importance. So general characteristics of the period. We know that there was widespread poverty and wickedness among the working class. So we had so craziness is this. Currently 6:12 p.m. Waiting on the governor to make potentially a historic announcement about the state of Michigan's schools moving forward for the rest of this year. However, that's by and large not something I'm tremendously concerned about right now. So these are ideas, or at least context, for British Victorianism. So chronologically, the Victorian period roughly coincides with the reign of Queen Elizabeth from 1836 to 1901. So technically it ends in 1901. It is 6 or 7 years prior to the start of World War I, but she lived so long that Victorianism changes quite a bit over the amount of time that she is the monarch. So in literature, the early Victorian age can be said to be the age of critical realism. And we'll define that for you a little bit more as we go. The critical realism of the 19th century flourished in the 40s and in the early 1850s. Puritan morality of the early and mid-Victorian period was reflected in the novels. And if you look at the novels that you have for your research paper, that's going to very much be true. So I'm going to read it again just to make sure that you have the information. And okay, there we go. Puritan morality of the early and mid-Victorian period was reflected in the novels. In Victorian novels, the society's effects on individuals are analyzed. So the central theme of many of these Victorian novels is society's effect on the individual. Society's effect on the individual. So certainly that's going to be something that should stand out to you in your notes. Now I have my notes here, but I want to make sure I underline that in case I come back to it at the end of this little piece. Secondarily, the Victorian era was the great age of the English novel. Realist, thickly plotted, crowded with characters, and long. So the characteristics of the Victorian novel, and you've already been through this, is that they are realistic, thickly plotted, crowded with characters, and long. Far longer than any other novels that you're going to end up reading. It was the ideal form to describe contemporary life and to entertain the middle class. So the novel describes contemporary life and it entertains the middle class. So the values and the ideas are very much going to be driven towards the middle class. So if you look at the novels of Charles Dickens, for example, they're full to overflowing with all kinds of drama, relationships, murders, hangings, involvement with the government. There's humor, and there's an endless portrayal of there's an endless variety of vivid characters and plot complications. Nonetheless, these novels spare nothing in the portrayal of what urban life was like for all classes. So the goal here is to accurately and in comprehensive detail characterize urban life for all classes that are involved. So you're not just going to focus on the poor. You're not just going to focus on those with money. So I think that's going to be a significant development here. I wrote down that William Makepeace Thackeray is best known for Vanity Fair. which wickedly satirizes hypocrisy and greed. So Vanity Fair, that's a novel that Mr. Hill in Honors has taught and uses for his materials. But certainly that's going to be an interesting perception of what's going on. Again, the portrayal of urban life and what it was like for all different classes of people. You're going to see that in something like Return of the Native. You're also going to see it in A Tale of Two Cities. It's called slice of life drama. It's just you're getting more varied slices of pie as you're going through, if you'll excuse the metaphor. To put everything into context, I want to look at three specific literary trends that we see in Victorianism. So one is going to be critical realism. One is going to be critical realism. This is a literary trend characterized by truthful description of life and criticism of its social and economic aspects. So critical realism is it's a literary trend characterized by truthful description and a criticism of the social and economic aspects of society. So again, this reminds me of American realism in the fact that this is about the criticism of social rules and social behaviors and sort of what goes wrong with the economics in a particular circumstance. So why the poor are unfairly in that position and why the system is broken or anything along those particular lines. But many of these novels give us the opportunity to study wealth and this critical realism as a measurable kind of idea. A second major trend, and this one will absolutely ring a bell because we did it in American Lit. Now, if you had me, we covered To Build a Fire and The Open Boat. White Fang would be an example as well, or The Call of the Wild. So, naturalism, Naturalism. Naturalism is an extreme form of realism in which the author shows the relation of a person to the environment and his or her surroundings. So the individual is at the whim of the environment. For example, if you have someone stranded in the Arctic, nature is hostile to the existence of man. No matter how much he cares, no matter how fragile he is, nature is just going to keep doing its thing. So we have critical realism and we have naturalism. Critical realism is a trend characterized by truthful description of life and the criticism of social and economic aspects. Naturalism is an extreme form of realism that studies man in relationship to his environment. You're going to see a lot of this in Thomas Hardy. My third point, and it gets a little bit technical because I find it to be tremendously interesting because of my art background. We talked about the pre-Raphaelites, or Raphaelites. So it's pre, that was not hard. Raphaelites, Raphaelites. The pre-Raphaelites. Now, here's where I would make my obligatory Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtle joke. So I'll just leave it at that. But again, the pre-Raphaelites, Victorian poets who aspired to the simplicity and directness in poetry similar to that of the medieval Italian art and existing before the Renaissance. It's about simplicity. So the pre-Raphaelites, you strip away all this extra language, and it basically is the idea that they are trying to go back to poetry that is simple, straightforward, not covered in all of this flowery language that we did with the Romantics, especially with people like Keats and Shelley and Byron that overly did it. So I think that's very, very significant. Now, just for the sake of this, Dante Gabriel Rossetti, Rossetti, I spelled that wrong, Rossetti, Rossetti was a poet and a painter. He was at the center of the group. I don't know very much about him, but I know his wife and the poetry that she wrote, and that's why I find that to be tremendously significant in its set of ideas. So make sure you have critical realism, naturalism, and you have information in your notes about the pre-Raphaelites, and I think that's going to be of good value to you. So I'm trying to structure this presentation in a way so it's not on one particular piece of it for too long. So your fourth salient feature, I gave you the three before. The fourth salient feature is that of sensuousness. This is, what do we feel? What do we touch? How are we engaged in what it is that we're seeing? So I'm going to read what I have here in my notes. Like Rossetti, most pre-Raphaelites were painters as well as poets. That explains much of their sensuousness of their poetry as well as their loving concern for detail. So if you're trying to put into words something that is brilliantly visual, this is a blending of those two things. Much of their poetry is as concrete as painting. Referring to Rossetti, Compton Rickett, who is a scholar, observes, quote, that the pictorial element is more insistent in Rossetti than in Keats is obviously due to the fact that Rossetti's outlook on the world is essentially that of a painter. This is all about the lens through which our authors are seeing the world. If you see the world through the lens of a painter, you are observant of more specific things. If you observe through the eyes of a poet, again, it's going to be more connotative, but it's certainly going to have a different impression than if you were looking at it through a different lens. So I think that's incredibly important. It depends. It's just because I have an interesting note here. It's how the author sees the pigments. The pigments are the quote-unquote images. They're the ideas that the author is perceiving. So how is it that we pluck that little rosebud, that idea that we're trying to get at, so that we see the bigger picture? So I think there's a lot there about this idea of sensuousness. If you remember, and this actually just popped into my head, in Romanticism, we spent a lot of time in the notes talking about sensuous nuance. So I would think that the sensuous nuance is exactly what we're talking about here. It's just captured in a little bit of a different way. So you've got four major characteristics. You want to make sure that you have those in your notes as we're going to now transition over to take a look at our sort of dominant Victorian poets, at least the ones that we're going to be talking about in this portion of the course. One last important slide here as we bring this presentation to its, I think, probably a natural conclusion here, is I want to take a look at some notable Victorian novelists, specifically the ones that we're going to be covering. So we've got Charles Dickens, without a doubt the most popular Victorian writer. His combination of sentimentality, so his combination of sentimentality or feeling, and his attack on social evils like poverty and wealth disparity and those kinds of things, made him highly successful. So David Copperfield, Great Expectations, A Tale of Two Cities, combines sentimentality and his attack on social evil. So I think very important. I just told you again what a major theme would be for you to address specifically in your novel. We know that Dickens is concerned with the problems of crime and poverty and the life of the lower class. This works with both Great Expectations and A Tale of Two Cities. We talk about both the Bronte sisters. So we know that Wuthering Heights and Agnes Grey, which is another Bronte sister novel, were accepted for publication before Charlotte had finished writing Jane Eyre. However, their publisher delayed bringing their novels out so that Jane Eyre was published first. It became a bestseller. So I just find some interesting things there. So Charlotte Bronte didn't write hers first, but it was published first because it was perceived to be more popular. It became a bestseller in an effort to cash in on the success of Jane Eyre. The publisher implied that Wuthering Heights and Agnes Grey were written by the author of Jane Eyre to the distress of all three of the Bronte sisters. So we have a little bit of tweaking of the truth to get Wuthering Heights more attention than it initially got, because they were associated with Charlotte Bronte. Just find that interesting. We know that the sisters wanted their works to be judged for their literary merit and not because they were women, and women writing novels was, if you'll pardon the pun, a novel idea. So they certainly published their novels under names which were not obviously masculine. So they came up with pen names. Acton, Currer, and Ellis Bell were the pseudonyms of the Bronte sisters, Charlotte, Emily, and Anne. Because initially Anne escaped my mind as the author of one of the works. So we know that preserving their male identity was so significant to the Bronte sisters that Charlotte maintained that identity even in writing to her publishers, because men had more of an opportunity than did women during the time. So I certainly find that to be an interesting idea. You talk about Thomas Hardy and why he's so significant. He's the last and greatest of the Victorian novelists. Why does he jump out at me? He's a local color writer. In all three of those novels, he describes real people in real environments. And I think that has a huge impact on what's going on. So, absolutely would I attend to these major authors and why they're so significant to the development of the work. Now, my last comment, a really important point. According to traditional writing techniques developed before the 20th century, a piece of narrative work should tell a vivid, interesting story and portray one or more characters who have distinct traits and who are often involved in a certain kind of psychological or social conflict, which, with the development of the plots, will in the end come to a clear solution. This is what Victorian literature grows into. It tells a vivid, interesting story and portrays one or more characters with distinct traits who get involved in the conflict that comes to a very specific resolution. A lot of craziness going on. So use this as a vehicle to flesh out your notes on Victorianism. And if we have to continue learning this way between now and the end of the year, so be it. But here's going to be the information for you. So make sure that you take your notes, you run back through these, and you make sure it's nice and clear. So there's a lot of detail in this particular presentation. It's designed to take the place of an in-class lecture, so you should have your characteristics of Victorian lit, you should have your salient features, you should have PowerPoints where you wrote information down, so you have these in your notes. Now, we're waiting on the governor's sort of announcement and our explanation of what's going on. So Keep these in your records. You'll have access to them as we progress through all of this. But ultimately, as we look at tests and finals and I think research papers, all of these resources are going to be of value. So I'm going to end our presentation here at the roughly 1 minute mark of this video. Stay safe, shelter in place, make sure you have enough food and you don't do anything crazy. Have a good day.